morning, everyone. On behalf of the Kansas Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or CASFA, I would like to welcome you to our presentation. Just a few housekeeping pieces. Up in the top-hand corner of your screen, you should see a button that says View. If you click on that and change it to speaker view, that's going to give you the best experience today. I do ask that you leave your cameras turned off and yourselves muted for the duration of the presentation. And then once we get to the Q&A information, we'll allow people to unmute themselves at that time. My name is Darcy. I am the Student Loan Coordinator at Emporia State University, and I currently serve CASFA as the past president, as well as a member of the Outreach Training Committee. And we're very excited to have you here today. And I am joined with two seasoned financial aid administrators. I will allow Juliana Reyes to first introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Juliana Reyes. I work at Emporia State University as a financial aid coordinator. I've been here for a little bit over 5 years, and I work specifically with verification. I administer athlete scholarships, and I'm also the school certifying official for veteran education benefits.
Thank you. And Kimberly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Kimberly Cashman, and currently I am not employed by an institution, but I have been involved in federal financial aid for over 5 years in the roles of assistant director and director. So I've handled a lot of the unique situations. I've worked at a 2-year public as well as a 4-year private, but I've attended as a student all types: 2-year public, 4-year private, 4-year public, also as a grad student too. So I've covered quite the bases.
Thank you very much. All right, so we will allow our presenters to start with their presentation, and we have left plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. We do have some of the questions that you have already submitted, so we will cover those, as well as if you have additional questions as we are going, please put them in the chat box, and I will have our presenters answer those at the end of the presentation. Juliana, take it away.
Thank you. Today, we're going to be presenting on busting unique situations, DACA, foster care, and question and answers. So what we're going to cover today is just a short overview of what FAFSA is, unique situation, foster care, word of the court, DACA, some resources for counselors and students, and we have some other presentations lined up for you guys. So students can complete the FAFSA by visiting studentaid.gov. The application for 22-23 will open up October 1st of 2021 and will remain open until June 30th of 2022. Currently, the one that is out there is for 21-22, which is the current academic year. There's also a mobile application the student can complete the FAFSA. They can download it in the App Store. It's called My Student Aid app. We also are going to have a detailed walkthrough of the changes to the FAFSA for the 22-23 academic year, and that's going to be provided on October 5th of 2021.
So to complete the FAFSA, there's a lot of information that not just the student, but also the parent completing the FAFSA with them will need to have. First and foremost, they need to have their social security number or alien registration number. These are needed not just to be placed into the FAFSA, but also to create that FSAID login, which we'll cover here in just a second. Students, if they worked and have filed taxes, and of course their parents, will need their tax and income information. Even if they don't file taxes, and there's certain situations where they won't, they will still need their wage information. So you always want to make sure that parents either have that W-2 information for the tax year being asked for by the FAFSA, or at least the last pay stub of that year. Untaxed income also gets included. We'll kind of touch on that. They also have to include any current cash, savings, and checking account balances. Now, those are as of the day they are completing the FAFSA. So if, let's say, the next day they have $10,000 show up in their account, we won't see that. We'll see what they have as of the day they complete the FAFSA. The other information we'll need to have, they'll need to have to complete the FAFSA is any investment information other than the home in which they live in, and a couple of other circumstances we'll touch on here in just a few minutes. So as I said a little bit earlier, the student and parents need to create an FSA ID. Now, there's a couple of caveats here. They obviously can go out to create them at studentaid.gov. Parents and students go to the same place. They have to have their own individual, but if a parent has already created an FSA ID for another student that they have that's already in college, then they don't need to create a second one. Because these FSA IDs are tied to both student and parents, to their socials and to their history. They've tied it through the vital statistics records. They've tied it to this person. They can't untie it, and they don't want to duplicate it because that creates a whole lot of errors. If there's two parents, only one has to create it. And they do have to have a valid email address, even if they have to sit there and create an email because they don't have one right then, they need to do that. But I also highly encourage every student I talk to not to use their high school email address. And the reason for that is because should they ever get locked out of their FSA ID, let's say it's junior year of college because they forgot the password, they're not going to be able to access their high school email. So you want to make sure that you are pointing your students to using a different email address, and they'll want to use these also, if they're applying to schools, those come real in handy to have that secondary email.
The Department of Ed considers anybody under the age of 24 a dependent student, unless they can answer yes to one of these questions. So if they're a veteran, active duty, married, children, or have other dependents, both parents deceased, foster care after the age of 13, dependent of ward of the court after age 13, emancipated minor, legal guardianship, homeless, or at risk of being homeless. So if a student answers no to these questions, they're considered a dependent, and parental information must be used to complete the FAFSA. So who's my parent? Parents living together regardless of marital status must include their combined information on the FAFSA. If parents are divorced or separated, then the parent that provided more than 50% of the student support in the last year must be on the FAFSA. Now, sometimes students will state that, or parents that both parents are splitting 50% of the support of the child, they have to choose one. But if that parent remarries, they must include their current spouse financial information as well. Grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians are not considered parents unless they have legally adopted the student.
There are unique situations that come up that require what we call use of professional judgment. In the role of as a director or sometimes an assistant director, you make these decisions. There's sometimes one person in each office. Every school has a different way of handling these situations. So for any student who's considering multiple schools, if they have a unique situation, they'll want to reach out to those schools independently to find out what the process is for each of those schools if they want to complete that process. One of those unique situations that we've come across is a dependency override. So dependency override occurs in a couple different ways. One is when the student is not able to provide parental information due to special circumstances. This can be that they don't speak to their parents. They have not supported them in any fashion. Usually you would have some sort of documentation to go along with this. A letter from the student doesn't really meet some of those requirements. as a director myself, I have asked for letters from counselors, or letters from a high school counselor, or letters from doctors, or somebody in a position of authority that knows the situation well, that can speak to it, in addition to other information. I asked for financials just to kind of figure out how the student's been supporting themselves if they haven't had that support. The students start with the process with the financial aid office because, like I said, everything can be different from one situation to the next. It is always an internal application. There is not a one-size-fits-all application that every school will accept. Now, the same documentation can be used in each independent school, but they'll want to check. Professional judgments in a tighter realm of understanding of professional judgments have very set specifics that we can look at. We can look at medical and dependent care expenses. This is above and beyond what the calculation allows for. There is a certain percentage that is already included in the calculation for medical expenses. So it has to be above and beyond that. Your financial aid administrator at that specific school can answer that as far as what that number is and will they be able to meet that percentage. I have seen parents do it, especially if there is a cancer treatment currently going on, or there was some other abnormal large medical expense. Death of a parent, that's often proved with something, the something from the funeral or the newspaper clipping of the bio. If there was a drastic change in income, COVID has been a perfect aspect of this, because you have parents who 2 years ago were making significantly more income than they are currently now. And so we can make those professional judgment consideration to change the income elements with the proper documentation. Each school will tell you what they need for that. And also a change of marital status. There's certain rules that surround that. Automatically getting married in the middle of the year doesn't automatically change a student's dependency status or even a parent's ability to report information. So always want to touch base with a financial aid administrator at the school they're choosing to go to.
So foster care and word of the court. So if the student answered yes to the question, if they were in foster care, word of the court at any point after the age of 13, then they are considered an independent student. So the school may require additional documentation. So encourage your student, if they have the core documentation, to start getting it ready, because more than likely the institution is going to ask for it. The institution will also have an internal application or a form. They have to attest that they were in legal guardianship. The state of Kansas, through the Department of Family and Children, does have an application available for students that were in this situation where their tuition can be waived. Every institution is a little different. Here at Emporia State, that starts with our registration office. There is an application that they have to submit through the Department of Family and Children, but they also have to contact a certain department and the institution that handles that specific waiver. But it can be different for any other institution. The Kansas Board of Regents did not oversee this program, so this is directly with the Department of Family and Children. Sometimes students will indicate on the FAFSA that they were in foster care, or maybe somebody that was taking care of them that was not biological parents, but then they don't have the proper documentation, the proper court documentation. Unfortunately, they would not be considered in foster care dependent of the ward if they don't have the proper documentation. And it could also be a letter from DCF just stating that they were in foster care for a certain amount of time. Legal guardianship. So once again, the school may ask for proper documentation, court documentation. If one parent got custody for the child, that does not mean that they're in legal guardianship. So it has to be somebody else that is not the student's biological parents or adoptive parents. So if they answer yes to this question, just make them aware that schools are going to inquire for court documentation. And again, there's going to be an internal application available, but this will make a student independent and no parental information would be required for the remaining of the time that they go through their college experience. Homeless or at risk. So this is if a student does not have regular housing, adequate housing at any point. For the new FAFSA, it's going to be July 1st of 2021. So this new FAFSA that opens up October 1st, then they can answer yes to this question. So this means if the student is living like in a shelter, it's living in an abandoned house, parks, motels, public spaces, camping grounds, then they can go ahead and answer yes, but this is only good for that given year. So if the student has a broken relationship with parents, parents kick the student out, they have no contact with the student, then we encourage the student to go through a dependency override, and that can be renewed every year for the time that they're attending college. Now, if they're applying to multiple schools, once again, each institution will probably require their own set of documentation. Now let's talk about emancipated minors. Again, there's going to be court documentation. A student cannot become emancipated if they're over the age of 18. So once again, there has to be court documentation involved, and we'll ask for that court documentation. So encourage students once again to get that information prepared and ready to submit to the different institutions that they've applied to. And there will be an internal application as well with the institution.
So DACA students have a unique situation, and it's because of our current political climate and how things have shifted on the legal grounds. I have had several undocumented students in my office sharing with me various stories and things that are going on. I'm originally from South Texas, so this was not an unusual thing for me to encounter. And every time I have a student that tells me that they qualify as a DACA student, my first reaction is to tell them actually not to complete the FAFSA. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. Under the current rules, they are currently not eligible, even if they have a valid Social Security number. This stands to change. Anything I say about DACA today is meant for only for today and the prior. It's all subject to change. So if something changes in the news, you'll definitely want to reach out to a financial administrator, because then we get updated information as well. Undocumented or DACA students who graduate from a Kansas high school may still be able to qualify for in-state tuition at Kansas colleges. I always encourage my students who reveal to me that they believe they're DACA or that they know they're undocumented to apply for scholarships. There is absolutely nothing wrong with them applying for scholarships. It's things that are tied to state and federal requirements for citizenship. That's where they're going to run into those problems. And just like federal aid, students aren't eligible for state aid. So usually I sit with my students who reveal their status and help them find scholarships. Sometimes they're institutional scholarships, and there are some foundations that do have specific funds set aside for these students. There's certain states that even have different processes for processing DACA students to still get them aid using similar information to what's included in the FAFSA. But my number one rule that I tell every DACA student is don't complete the FAFSA. It's not going to get you anywhere, and it's going to be a lot of time, and it's just going to frustrate. Documented students can still qualify for aid even if their parents are undocumented, and this happens quite frequently. The Department of Education does not share any information with Homeland Security, and that has always been a question that gets asked. Well, I don't want to get my parents in trouble because, yeah, they brought me here, but they're not documented. But I am. I was born here. So when we consult with these students, what we tell them is they should report the Social Security for their parents as all zeros. They may have a tax ID number that does not get used. Because if it does get used, we do have to correct it before we can process the file, because it will not clear the initial checks. An undocumented parent is also not going to be able to obtain an FSA ID because they're not going to be able to check those vital statistics. They're not going to be able to check that social. So generally what happens is once a student completes their FAFSA and they get to the end, it'll give them the option to print the signature page and mail it. Any school can help a student with this. Any college can help a student with this. Any financial aid office, even if they're not going there, we can still help them. But we can get that done. It's just DACA students, these are the main takeaways from it. DACA students don't do the FAFSA. If the parents are undocumented, students definitely still need to do the FAFSA. There's just going to be a couple of extra steps. So this slide has a bunch of information, and I'm almost positive this is going to actually be out on the CASPA website. So you will have access to these links. But our website is a great resource. We put out information about how to help counselors help their students before they get to the college level. The Kansas Board of Regents website is phenomenal for scholarships and for information about those scholarships. Department of Education, studentaid.gov, this is now the department's hub website, if you will. It ties everything together. So they do their FSA ID, they apply for aid, they monitor loans, and there's tons of useful information out there. But if you have something specific, I always encourage my counselors for the high schools that I do visit to reach out. And if you have a unique situation or a question, I always tell them, hey, email me. Shoot me an email. We can schedule a time to talk if it's too much to type, or if you just want to send me a quick email, I can point you in the right direction of the information so you don't have to go out and feel your way around all the information. The last website that we list here is NASFA. NASFA is the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. They have quite a bit of information out there. It does contain more of the legalese when it comes down to the verbiage that's used, but again, we can help decipher that, decode that. It's a lot out there, but we can help you with that as well. The main takeaway is don't be afraid to reach out to all of us. That's what we're here for.
And with that said, now we're going to go ahead and jump into our question and answers. There was quite a bit of questions regarding student loans. So we're going to go ahead and start that. And Darcy Johnston, who is our loan expert here, is going to just go over the questions and answer those. So go ahead and take it away, Darcy.
All right. Juliana, if you don't mind, I actually would like to jump to some of the questions that have come up in the chat during the presentation. So Yuli, if you could go back to the who is my parent slide.
Yes.
Okay, so we did have a question that I think there might have been a little bit of confusion about when they need to use the biological parents and when they need to use the step parents. So if you could go into that in a little more detail and maybe provide some examples of those.
Sure. So if the student is completing the FAFSA today, so when you complete the FAFSA, it's like a snapshot of the life you are living that day. So if parents are separated and you're using, one biological parent and they got remarried, and the day that the student submits the FAFSA, if the parent's already married, then they must include their current spouse's financial information. So they would be listed as parent two, even though they're not the biological parent, but you're using the other parent who is biological. And use their tax information. It could be that they already filed married filing jointly. If they, for some reason, got married right before the student submitted the FAFSA, then in the financial aid office, we're able to combine that information to include the step parent's information with the other parent information. So we combine the tax information. But if you submit a tax return that it's married filing jointly and the parent's marital status is divorce separated, that's going to come back as a tax status review to institutions. So we're going to ask for that documentation because it's conflicting. You can't be divorced and single or separated and file married jointly. Now, tax law does let some parents file head of household, each parent file head of household under certain circumstances. But if you're married, you only have two choices: married filing jointly or married filing separately. So that student will need to include the new step parents' tax information if that's what their life is like the day that they submitted the FAFSA.
So just to clarify, if if a student has biological parents that have been divorced for the last 15 years and they are not living together, do they use both of their biological parents on the FAFSA?
No, they just list the parent who provides more than half of the support of the student.
All right, thank you very much. If you will move to the next slide on dependency override and professional judgment. Kimberly, we have a counselor that would like to know what information needs to be in that letter from the counselor or the school official when you are doing a dependency override.
That is kind of a harder question to answer because there's not a specific formula for each situation. What I have always based my decisions off of what I need in a letter is based on the situation. For example, if let's say the student is not able to provide parent information because both biological parents, one is in jail and the other it has never been involved in their lives and they don't even know how to contact them, there would be somebody who could write that letter that knows the situation. So I'd ask for them to include dates, kind of what the overall situation is, and if there's any documentation. Generally, if a parent is incarcerated and the other parent is not in the student's life, somebody will have been given some rights over the student so that they're taken care of. So usually there's some documentation there, but generally if it's a letter coming from the counselor or a school official, I like to see all of the information they have on them on file, to a degree, dates, what's going on, what do they know, just kind of those explaining the situation things. And that's how I've always explained it. Explain to me the situation, what you know, and when you knew it happened.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question. If a student needs to address a unique situation with the school they are wanting to attend, do they wait to fill out the FAFSA until after the dependency override or PJ process?
No, we have to have that FAFSA first. Because if you turn in all the documentation, what happens is we end up holding on to it and waiting for the FAFSA to come in, because then we have no data to adjust if we don't have the FAFSA. So they can fill out the FAFSA as soon as possible. Let's say they fill it out October 1, and they may not come in to see me to do a dependency override or follow a professional judgment process until May or June of the next year, just before they're getting ready to come on campus. And we can still make those adjustments then.
And there is a space available on the actual FAFSA where it asks if you want to provide parental information, and the student will just indicate no. And there is a place where they can put, I have a special circumstance, and submit the application.
Yes, thank you for that.
All right, thank you both. Yuli, if you'll go to the homeless unaccompanied minor slide. Thank you. So we do have a question. Unaccompanied student is not the same as a homeless student, correct?
Correct. So this means that the student is not living physically with a parent or guardian. So it could be grandparent, it could be uncle. And so what I would encourage the student to go ahead and select yes to this question, but then follow up with, at Emporia State, we don't question students that indicate that they're homeless or unaccompanied. But if they do it again for the upcoming year or the following year, we may ask them just to go ahead and move forward with the dependency override so they can provide proper documentation and just make them independent. And so they'll do a renewal every year. So if they are not living in physical custody of a parent or guardian, then they can go ahead and answer yes to this question.
Thank you. And then would students be considered homeless if they qualify for McKinney-Vento?
Yes.
And can you explain a little bit why we do recommend that they do the dependency override early on in their college career as opposed to using this unaccompanied minor?
So the
Question.
FAFSA is only good for that given year. So for the 22-23, the months that it covers is from July 1st to 2021 to June 30th of 2022. So the student situation might be a little different for the upcoming year. But if they've, like I said, are living in inadequate housing, if they are not in physical, if they've never been in physical custody of parents or guardians and have always lived with maybe uncle or grandma, it will just make their renewal of the FAFSA so much easier. And what they need to do is just indicate on the FAFSA that they're not going to provide parental information, that they have a special circumstance, and then follow up with the institution that they're attending and just do a renewal of the dependency override once it's been approved. So for that first year, they'll do, if they're here for 4 or 5 years, the process of the dependency override. And then the upcoming years, they would just do the renewal. And so at our institution, we have a form that the student completes after they submit their FAFSA, and our director handles dependency overrides and PJs. And so that form would just go to our director, and our director would override whatever needs to be override so we can package the student for the upcoming year.
Thank you. Kimberly, I know you've worked at 2 different institutions. Could you give us some examples of how you might have seen the process handled differently at those institutions?
Yeah, so at one of the institutions I was at, we looked at the FAFSA and we went off what the FAFSA told us. And if they told us that there was that special circumstance and we found out why, if a student was doing a dependency override, we had documentation, a form that they had to complete. And then it told them specifically what documentation we needed to be turned in with that form. And then we actually physically moved that group of documents from one year to the next, and every year to do the renewal for a dependency override or for any type of professional judgment. If the issue was still the same as before, the student just has to write a statement and sign it and date it and turn it into our office for the next academic year. Generally, we try to have students wait until the end of April, early May to do that renewal process. Just so that way we make sure that we get through the year and things haven't fully changed. So that way we can still get them their offer letter to let them know what they're eligible for, but we maintain that documentation. So if we ever get questioned by the Department of Education, why do we make these changes? We can show proof. The other institution that I've been at also had a different process. So when it came in on the FAFSA as an unusual circumstance, we would inquire with the student, gain the documentation, and then that school would just continue the override for the 4 years because their packaging model was significantly different. And so the aid amount never changed outside of what changes were made to the federal aid.
Thank you.
And the statement could be as simple as, my situation has not changed from the previous year. I'm currently still living under the circumstance. It doesn't have to be very detailed. It can be, 1 to 2 sentences.
Yes, please don't turn in paragraphs.
All right. So moving on to some scenario-based questions. I have a male student that has been moving around school to school because his mom is an alcoholic. His sister was a dropout, and his dad is apparently not in the picture. He has since moved in with his girlfriend and her parents. Can he claim unaccompanied minor status or homeless status, or what should he do in this situation?
Yes, I would say the student can say yes for either of the situations. And then I would encourage the student to actually follow up with whatever institution he will be attending and do a dependency override.
I would even currently assuming the student is still in high school, I would even encourage them to get with their high school to get that documentation in place at the high school. So that way, when they need it for college, it's a lot easier for them to locate. And that is generally the issue that I've come up against is students that have these unusual circumstances getting me proper documentation. That becomes the battle.
All right. This is one of those, we tend to have a lot of but if answers in financial aid because as you've heard us say, there's lots of unusual circumstances. And so this question may have a couple of different answers to it. If a student becomes unsupported by their parents during the school year, does a student have to report the parent's income on the FAFSA?
Yes. So if the student has still living with the parent, so unsupported, I guess I would need to know more details about what unsupported means if they're not living with parents anymore, if the student's on their own. But the Department of Ed states that if they have a good relationship and students still living with the parent, then the student needs to provide parental information. Now, if the parent refuses, does not want to share information regarding tax information, financial aid administrators can help that parent educate them on why we need that information and how they're actually doing a disservice to their child for not giving that tax information. Because if they have a good relationship and they don't meet the qualification to become an independent student, parental information needs to be on the FAFSA. And so what happens when a parent refuses to give students information, then we can't offer them a financial aid package if their relationship is still good. Now, if it's broken, if it's abusive, then we can go different routes. But if they just choose not to provide the tax information or create an FSA ID, unfortunately, the only way we can help is educate that parent on how that process or that choice of refusing is hurting the student.
And I've had a similar scenario to this. We had a student who actually started with our institution in a fall semester, and 3 weeks into the fall semester, she's requesting a change to her FAFSA from dependent to independent. And we got documentation, even a letter from her mental health counselor detailing the situation and the recommendation from the mental health counselor that the student go no contact with the parent. And there was a whole lot of documentation that we had to gather, but that was the only time that I know that I've made a mid-year change, and it was because of the drastic swing of the situation. So while they're not common, they can happen, but I've only had one in 5 years.
Thank you. I have another student that currently lives with her grandparents. Mom is in town, but lives with her boyfriend. Her dad is not in the picture. Since she lives with her grandparents, should she use her grandparents' information on the FAFSA?
No, she should not use grandparents' information on the FAFSA.
So the student, go ahead.
Does
she need to use mom's information?
So if they have a good relationship with mom and mom's been in the picture, then they should use mom's tax information and parental information on the FAFSA.
All right. That one. If you can move to the foster care slide. Okay. Are benefits available to students who were in foster care but have been adopted by relatives?
So that is a little different. I've seen situations where students were adopted like at age 16, 17, but were in foster care. That would still make them independent. But if they legally adopted them earlier on, then that legal, I guess, adoptive parent would act as a biological parent, like they would have to include parental information on the FAFSA, and they would be considered a dependent student.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that's asking about a parent that doesn't file income taxes because he's retired military and fully disabled. I'm going to encourage that individual attend the October 5th session on the step-by-step walkthrough of the FAFSA, because that should be, how to handle that situation should be included in that presentation. And Yuli, if you can go ahead and move to the undocumented/DACA slide. And I have a question that I'm going to surprise Linda Oldham Burns with. So Linda, if you could unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm here.
Hello. So Linda is the chair of our outreach training committee, and she also works for the Kansas Board of Regents. And Linda, I'm asking you this question because it's specifically to the Board of Regents. Can undocumented students qualify for the Board of Regents scholarships?
Unfortunately not. We are following some of the federal guidelines for our state scholarships. So in the state of Kansas, the Kansas Board of Regents cannot offer scholarships to the undocumented students. I would echo what has been said, that scholarships is the way to go for undocumented students. So maybe a different state has a different rules about that, but there are lots of places to look for scholarships other than the state level.
Thank you very much for that. So we do have several questions on undocumented students. So is this student in this situation I'm about to describe DACA or undocumented? She is a legal citizen born here, but her parents are not.
So this student is a US citizen if they're born here. And so they would just follow the undocumented, I guess, procedures. So parents would be reported as 0, and the signature page would be printed out and mailed to the Department of Ed for processing.
Okay. And then that same family has taken in a cousin who is here in a refugee status. And do they count that cousin as part of their family size since she's living with them now?
Yes, they can go ahead and do that.
Okay. And we have a situation where a student is a US citizen, but both parents live and work in Mexico. Because there's no US tax return form for the parents, how would they go about filling out their FAFSA?
I actually encountered a situation like this about a year ago. So the student can try to get the parent's signature electronically, maybe send the signature page via email to the parent and have the parent sign it and then scan it in and send it back to the student so the student can mail it out to the Department of Ed. If they work and they don't file an income tax in Mexico, then we can take a written statement of why they don't file and how much they're making. And we would, as financial aid administrators, alter the FAFSA to include wage. We'll have to do the currency exchange and everything like that, and enter in that information. But I have encountered a situation like that where the student provided that information to us and we were able to provide a financial aid offer. But it can be done if they have no means to, like they live in a very remote location where they can't get the signature page. I haven't encountered that, but financial aid administrators can definitely look at the regs and look at their compliance assistants or compliance representatives within their office to see how they can best handle that situation.
Okay. Go ahead, Kimberly.
It is also entirely possible that a student in this situation where the parents are not physically here and the student is here, I would be asking questions of who's actually supporting them, where are they staying, because there might also be a different route we need to take. Sometimes those situations, once we start asking questions, we find out that they actually qualify for a dependency override, or they have other extenuating circumstances. Some of those really depend on the situation as far as determining what your next steps are going to be. So any student you have that is in that situation, prepare them to get asked a lot of questions.
Yes, and then we also have the ability to translate a tax return. So if the parent had filed a tax return, we would have to translate that information in-house. So that is also possible.
And so I would, just because I've seen that process and what we've had tax returns from other countries that we've had to translate, that can take a little bit. So if you have students in that situation, please have them get their FAFSA in early and get that documentation to us early, just so that we have time to get that process for them. Okay, so moving into dependency. So there's a senior parent who is a mother, so she does have a child of her own. Is she still a dependent of her parents in this situation? Yuli, I know you've encountered this a lot.
Yes, that is still, if parents don't file tax returns, but parents are older, they're still considered a dependent student. The Department of Ed requires, and this will be talked a little more in our October 5th training session, requires for parents that don't file a tax return to provide a non-filing letter. And so we would just encourage students to start the process early, because it does take the Department of the IRS a while to get those letters. And so it's just a letter that says that there's not a tax return on file. But if the student is a dependent student and the parent does not file a tax return, we need that letter in order to move forward to package the student.
Okay. On the flip side of that, the high school senior themselves have a child.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yes,
I thought like a senior citizen. I'm sorry.
I've actually encountered this situation at one of my institutions, where we had a high school student who was a mom, and she was living with her parents still, and she answered yes to being independent, but she had no income. And so it raised a lot of red flags because she did also include parent information. So we asked a lot of questions, and we even actually ended up, our office contacted Department of Education to ask for clarification. And what we got told was that if that parent is living with their parents and not providing more than 50% of the support for their child because they have no income, then if their parents are providing more than 50% of the support, then they reverse back to dependent students and include the child in that household. So it would be a 2-parent household with the student and the baby, and with parent information. So those questions get very sticky as well, because it depends on if that senior student is working and supporting that child, or even if they have state assistance. State assistance still counts as support. So we ran the gamut on that one. It was a 2-week file.
Yes, and so in our office, we typically, if a high school senior states, that they have a child or are expecting a child within the academic year, and we notice that they have 0 income that was reported, then we do a proof of dependency. And so we'll have the student complete a form, tell us more information. If they have state assistance like medical coverage, or if they're getting WIC, we want it translated in dollars. And then we have a figure. If they meet, then they're considered independent. But if they, don't have any wages, don't have any state assistance, then they would have to use parental information and be dependent.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to foster care questions and how it relates to dependency. So a student is in foster care at ages 13 and 14, but at age 15, they are adopted out of foster care. Do they file as dependent or independent?
Well, if they were at any point after the age of 13 in foster care, then they would be considered independent.
And according to the rules, it is just one day after they turned 13. We had a student who was adopted on the second day after their 13th birthday, and they still qualified because they were still in the system for one day after their 13th birthday.
Okay.
So,
okay, so another question on the which parents to include, and we just want to reiterate that you just include if the biological parents are not together, so they're not married and they're not living together, then you use one of the biological parents and their current spouse. So there's only ever going to be two parents listed on the FAFSA at most.
Yes, that is correct. And I've seen a situation where maybe biological parent left and step parent was help raising the child. And so they used the step parent's tax information. So that can't happen. If they legally did not adopt you, then you cannot use only stepdad's information on the FAFSA. We would have to go to a different route on why your biological parent is not providing that tax information.
Okay, and another scenario, I have a student whose parents are married but live separately. So the parents are married. Mother files head of household and father files single. Mother claims the student on her taxes and provides more than 50% of the support for the student. Does the income of the father still need to be provided?
So go ahead.
I would actually have a couple of questions on this, and I've actually encountered this. So my first response would be, I'd want documentation from a tax professional if they file their taxes through somebody like TurboTax or H&R Block. I would want a letter from that tax professional stating that this is the correct filing status for both of these people, because if they are married, even they should be filing married separate. So I would first question that, because that is a requirement. We have to know those things too. But then in this case, if they are truly still married and maintaining two different households, you kind of have to get into a little bit more sticky. Is the mother's claiming and says that they provide more than 50%, then we would have at my institution, they would have a form that they would have to complete that says that dad does not support, or dad has established a separate household, and we'd have to have a signed separation, notice of separation affidavit, basically stating that the parents attest that on this date they separated and they maintain two different households. But given that taxes run 2 years behind, we've started running into this a whole lot once we went to prior year, especially at my 2-year public institution. So there's a lot here in this scenario. So if this is an exact scenario you're looking at, I would highly encourage you to reach out to the aid administrator at that school, because they're going to probably ask some questions too.
I would second that. And so if the parents are they're claiming to be married, they're not separated, they just choose to maintain two different households, but they're still married, then I would say they would both need to have their combined information on the FAFSA if that's what their marital status is.
Thank you. So now a slightly different situation. In this case, the student's parents are divorced. The student has lived with her father for most of the last year, but recently moved in with her mother, and her mother now has custody of her. Whose taxes should be used on the FAFSA?
That is up to their discretion. So whoever provided more than half of the support in the last year, that's who should be on the FAFSA. But financial aid administrators do not check what parents providing what. It's up to the student's discretion. You're signing that application, and you're stating that whatever you reported is true and correct. So that's what we're going to take.
Okay. And so I know we've covered this a couple of times, but just to clarify, excuse me, a student is a US citizen, but they have undocumented parents. Do they provide income information for their undocumented parents on the FAFSA?
Do you want to take it, Kimberly?
Yeah, if they have it, absolutely. If it comes in without the income information, we're going to ask anyways. But if it's something, some students don't know how to do the conversions, so they always bring them to our office anyways. We would still need income information of some sort. But as soon as the zeros are put in, to be perfectly honest, when that FAFSA comes into our office, we're going to know to ask some questions anyways. So they just do need to be prepared to provide information if they have it.
Thank you.
Yes, and so we will also follow up, if they were selected for verification with the tax transcript or a copy of a tax return. And so we would just double check the information is correct. And if it's not, then we would make changes so that it can reflect the actual tax documentation. But more than likely, if they filed a tax return using an alternative number, then that's the tax transcript we're going to take.
Thank you. So we have established that students need to fill out their FAFSA first. And then if they have one of these unusual circumstances, they should reach out to the financial aid office after they have submitted their FAFSA. How soon do they need to reach out to the financial aid officer? How long should they wait after filling out their FAFSA before they reach out to the financial aid office?
So I know at one of my institutions, we would actually send out a letter that said, hey, we got your FAFSA and we're in the process, we're processing it. At that time would be the time to reach out. But at my other institution, we did not do that. We processed the information that we had and went ahead and generated their offer letter, excluding their federal offer, because we always had institutional funds that we awarded. So anytime you get that kind of communication, reach out to us. But if at some point at my two-year institution, we did stop sending our letters of, hey, we got your FAFSA for a while. So we were telling everybody within 2 weeks. It does take, about a week or so to 2 weeks for it to process through Department of Education. And then we have a couple of days where we review. But we were processing files every day. Some schools only process once a week. So it is dependent. I would say within 2 weeks would be a good time frame to reach out.
Right. So once the new FAFSA opens up here, October 1st, at Emporia State University, we don't start telling students, I guess, our requirements if they were selected for verification until like a couple months later. We do have to wait for like some guidance from the Department of Ed, like the Pell charts need to be published. Is that right, Darcy?
Before we start awarding, yes.
Yeah. And so they can reach out to us and ask us if we received their FAFSA. I believe we also sent confirmation that we received their FAFSA, but it does take at least our institution a little bit to actually provide additional documentation for the upcoming year.
Yeah. So moral of the story, it's never going to hurt for them to reach out. So once they submit their FAFSA, I would recommend that they reach out to each school that they've sent it to and say, hey, I have this unique situation. I know I'm going to need to work with you. What does the time frame look on that? Because then each financial aid office can say, we aren't able to load your FAFSAs into our system yet because of a software update, but get back with us on November 1st, or hey, we can start working on this now. So it's really going to depend on the school and the situation. So just have those students reach out to those aid offices. So we have talked about the age cutoff for foster students adoption still qualify. So even one day after the age of 13, as long as they were in foster care, at least one day after their 13th birthday, they are still an independent student. If a student graduates from high school while living in a group home or foster home, what type of documentation is needed, and is tuition paid by the state for all state education institutions?
I think it's if they were in foster care, then they need to follow up with DCF, because DCF is the one that pays the bill. So there's going to be a proper application that needs to be completed, and then DCF will determine if they, will waive the tuition at that institution and pay the bill. Now, if they were living in a group home because they were homeless, or anything like that, then we can move to a different, and they don't have proper court documentation, then we can move through a different route.
In these situations, what I've done before is I would ask for documentation from their caseworker, because most likely there's going to be a case for the student from DCF. So I would ask for that documentation. And at the two institutions that I'd been at, the state did communicate, the student had to initiate with their caseworker to have them notify, hey, I'm going to school, here's where I'm going. The state would then communicate directly with our business office. So actually in both places I was at, the financial aid office was not part of this process. We were just notified on the backside that, hey, we did get payment for this, because we don't, that's not included in some of our calculations. It's just more of a notice for us. So really they're going to work directly with the business office at that institution.
Thank you. We have some more questions about how to report the income if the parents are living and working in another country. I know we've answered that a couple of times, and I'm going to also recommend that you attend the October 5th session for the step-by-step FAFSA, because that would be covered in more detail there as well. What is the option for high school seniors who live on their own, such as a boyfriend and girlfriend living together? However, they do have a good relationship with their parents.
Then they would have to use parental information.
The only way that changes is if they get married.
Yeah. So unless they get married, if
or have a child that they're supporting,
or have a child that they're supporting, they must provide parental information.
Yes.
Is there a department that you know of within DCF that can assist with foster care applicants, or should they start with the caseworkers? And the reason that's asked is because a lot of times the caseworkers from younger childhood are often not still working on their case, or even in the foster care system anymore.
I do not know of a specific department, but I know that if they start the process early, that documentation is scanned, saved somewhere, that they can be able to retrieve it just by contacting DCF. And then completing the application through DCF, and maybe DCF can pull that information for them. They can verify it, since they'll ask for, student contact information, or maybe if they have a case number that they remember from previous documents that they can list on there. But I don't know of any specific department within DCF.
Linda just actually provided the email address. I knew there was a specific email address, so thank you, Linda. She just provided the email address specific to DCF for this, tuition waivers at dcf.kansas.gov. I have seen students send just a general email, hey, I need to do this, and they'll get a response back asking for information, and then it gets taken care of and the form comes. But if they know their caseworker, it's good to go through their caseworker if they're still there. But if they're not, this is a good option. A lot of times with the students I was working with, they had aged out of the system, so they did not have they didn't have a specific caseworker that they spoke to all the time or that they were familiar with. It was somebody assigned to their case. Linda also says that the application is linked on the Kansas Board of Regents scholarship page. So that is a good place to go jump out to have your students fill them out. I would recommend, just having seen how quickly my business office gets overrun with these documents sometimes. At a 2-year public, they generally do have significant stack, I would encourage them that as soon as they are enrolled in their first round of college classes, that they get in the habit of, as soon as they're enrolled, they reach out, they let them know, this is what I'm enrolled in, this is what the cost is. So that way those documents can get processed and get taken care of. I've seen a lot of students panic when things aren't taken care of on day one, because there is a process that has to happen. So if you can, when you know your students are enrolling, or if they tell you, hey, I went and enrolled for college today and I picked my classes, let them know to go ahead. Okay, if you know that situation, let them know to go ahead and do this process. Otherwise, they could end up seeing a balance due for a large number that they don't really owe, and then they come in panicking. I like to avoid the panic.
Juliana, will financial aid ever be offered to high school students taking dual credit courses?
No. So one of the eligibility requirements for federal aid is for a student to have a high school diploma and or a GED. So they have to have that first before they can actually qualify for federal aid.
Thank you. All right, that seems that we've answered all of the questions that pertain to our unique situations that we've discussed today. As Juliana mentioned earlier, we did have some questions coming in advance about loans. So I'm going to go ahead and answer those. And if you all have more questions and want to put them into the chat, then once we're done with these loan questions, we'll come back to those chat questions. When can a student begin paying on their loans? So that's a great question. While they're in school, as long as they're half-time or greater, they are not required to make payments because they would qualify for an in-school deferment status. However, even while they're in that in-school deferment status, they're able to start making payments on their loans if they want. Because they qualify for the in-school deferment based upon their enrollment, even if they make one payment, that doesn't trigger repayment to start for them, because that in-school deferment supersedes everything else. I highly recommend, if they're borrowing unsubsidized loans, the ones that are accruing interest from the beginning of once the loan's dispersed, that they do at least try and make interest payments while they're in school. And a couple of weeks after their loan disperses, they'll be able to log on to studentaid.gov and look at their student aid dashboard and see who their loan servicer is, and could start reaching out to them about the procedures to make payments when they want. Now, they will have to start making payments 6 months after they drop below a half-time status. And so they have that 1 6-month grace period, but they only get 1 6-month grace period on their loans. And so let's say they attended for 2 years and then dropped out. 6 months later, they'd have to start making payments on the loans that they borrowed during those 2 years. If they then return to school later, all of those loans would go back into an in-school deferment. But once they stop attending again, then those loans that they had previously that had already been in repayment, they don't get another grace period on those. So they'd have to start making payments immediately on those loans from their first 2 years, but they'd have a new 6-month grace period on the loans that they took after they returned to school. How much loans can a student receive per year? And so that is going to depend upon their academic standing. So for a freshman level student, which is someone who has less than 30 credit hours of college credit, they can get up to $5,500 as a dependent student. So if they have to use their parents' information, they could get up to $5,500 in the Stafford loans. If they're not required to use their parents' information because they qualify as an independent student, then at that freshman level, they could get up to $9,500 for the year. And then that increases based upon when they become a sophomore, it increases and then increases again for junior, and then the junior and senior levels are both the same for each year. But it is on the number of credit hours that they have completed. It's not based upon how many years they've been in college. And are there loans that can be given while a student is waiting on their disbursement? Not sure exactly what you're meaning on this, but I'll give a couple of examples. So a student may apply for a private student loan, and that would be separate from the federal loans that they could borrow from the government as a result of filling out the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA. And so, yes, it is possible that those private loan funds could come in before their federal loan funds do. However, those private loans take longer for processing, so it's going to depend on when they've applied for it. If they were selected for verification, there is a possibility that some of their unsubsidized loans could be paid out to them. But I don't believe that most schools follow that practice, just because if they never finish verification, that money would have to be pulled back because the student wouldn't have been eligible for it. And so it's easier just to have that verification process finished. There are some institutions that might have institutional loans that are available to students. And so that might be a situation. So that question, I'm going to recommend that you talk to the financial aid office at the school where they're planning on attending, and ask that specifically to them. And how to better explain the importance of paying back financial aid loans. Music to my ears. Really education, explaining to them how this is impacting their credit score, because these federal loans are reported on their credit report. It is impacting their credit score, and it can impact their ability to get a job or to buy a house or even get an apartment. And so in the education that I do with students now, I explained there are a lot of employers that do credit checks. And so if you have bad credit, you may not get your dream job. Even if you're not planning on buying a house or buying a car, there are lots of landlords that will now do credit checks and not rent to you if you have poor credit, because they're afraid they're not going to get their rent check from you. And so that is very important. It seems like explaining those real world scenarios to them helps that a little bit. We want them to pay back their loans because it affects our cohort default rate and how we can administer financial aid to future students. And so we do explain that to them as well. And then I also recommend that you attend the session in March on financial literacy, because they will have more information on that for you as well. So the going back a couple of questions, when we answered the question about if financial aid would ever be offered to high school students taking dual credit courses, someone asked, would they be eligible for HERF funds? Would a high school student taking dual college credits be eligible for HERF funds?
No. So they have to be degree seeking for those funds. So you have to be, depending on the, I guess, because we've already had quite a few money come in. This last round, students had to be degree seeking, enrolled in 6 credit hours or more. So somebody who is taking dual credit hours is not degree seeking at that institution.
And HERF funds are the Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds. So money that came out of the CARES Act. There was another round early last winter, and then again with the American Rescue Plan. And then Monica's last question has a 2-part. So I'll answer the first half. So if a student comes in with more than 30 college credit hours, how much would that student be awarded as a first-year student, or would they be a sophomore? So Monica, once their transfer hours were processed, if they had over 30 credit hours, then we could offer them these sophomore level loans. And it's going to depend on like at Emporia State, initially they would be offered as a freshman. And then once their transfer work was processed and their grade level had increased, they could come into our office and request that additional $1,000. Different institutions may process that differently. So definitely have them check with them. And then would that student, if they were coming in with more than 30 credit hours, college credit hours, would they be considered a freshman as an institutional scholarship? Kimberly, what have you seen at your institutions?
So this question varies because it goes back to what hours are accepted and how they're accounted for. At one institution, whatever credit was sent from a prior institution was automatically accepted. When it came to scholarship awarding, they were awarded their institutional scholarship dollars, and it didn't change based on academic year. What they came in as is what they stayed as until they left. But at my other institution, certain scholarships were only eligible for freshmen. And so how our foundation decided freshman is determined was it was a freshman in their first year at the institution. They actually did not go by credit hours. So you have kind of different scenarios that run across. Those are things that may or may not be handled in the financial aid office. If there is a foundation office that determines scholarship dollars, they're going to be the ones that can set that rule. For any institutional aid, it can behave differently than federal aid. So it really depends on the school and how they're set up. So for that particular piece of that question, I would certainly reach out to their scholarship office, their financial aid office, and ask that question because it does differ from school to school.
Juliana, anything to add to that?
No, I think it just determines on how the school classifies an incoming freshman. So first time, never attended a college campus, even if they were taking dual credit hours. So I guess just reach out to the institution that the student's attending.
Okay. And so just to let you all know, we have recorded this session, and the recording will be available once we were able to get it processed and up to YouTube. So we will link it to the CASPA webpage where all of the counselor training sessions are listed at. It will be linked under this session. And we also will send out an email to you once that's available to let you know that it's out there. And we do have these upcoming sessions. You've heard us reference them a number of times, but just to kind of give you some more information, on October 5th, we have a session where we have financial aid administrators that are going to walk through the FAFSA step by step. This is one of the most requested sessions from you all. So we are getting it implemented, and I'm going to move forward with that one. So we're excited about it. On November 9th, asking for what you really want, that free money. Who doesn't want free money? So how to write those scholarship essays, how to tailor that to the unique student situation, what to make sure they have in there. November 16th, searching for lost treasure, how to find those scholarships. There's many, many places out there. So how do you not get overwhelmed, and how do you know what's a scam and what's not a scam? February 10th is a look into the future. So we are going to discuss what those students need to be looking for on their financial aid offers. We'll talk a little bit about the verification process, the Kansas Promise Act, and then there are some major changes coming to the FAFSA in a couple of years. So we're going to start to do a highlight of that. So just to clarify, the 22-23 FAFSA, there's been a couple of minor changes that will be discussed on October 5th. Nothing major has changed yet, but coming up in a couple of years, there's going to be some differences, and we just kind of want to give you a head start on what to look for with that. And then on March 2nd, we will have our financial literacy topic, how to teach financial literacy, how to help with your own financial literacy. The slides from today's presentation are also linked out on our CASPA website.